Between 1960 and 2025, 22 heads of state in Africa have been assassinated. Who wanted them dead and why? Today, we are going to explore that because the answer to that question is very, very critical in terms of helping us to understand what we're up against here in Africa. I'm DJ Bwakali, and Africa is my superpower. Welcome to the first episode of African Awakening. This is your show. This is our show. It's all about the African awakening. Unless the people of Africa awaken, we are going to continue being taken for a ride and we'll have ourselves to blame. So the main aim of this show is to ensure that together we can be able to awaken. You see, the Pan-African sun is rising. No force on earth, nobody in this world can be able to keep it from rising. I want to take you on a safari. I want to take you on a safari across Africa. And this safari is going to unveil what is really happening on this continent, and it's going to unveil to you why Pan-Africanism matters to you today. Why Pan-Africanism can make your life better or worse. You're going to understand why it's not just about history. It's not just about those who are crazy about Africa, but it is about you and I. It's about all the 1.5 billion Africans in the motherland. And it's about all the millions of Africans in the diaspora. We have to understand why Pan-Africanism matters. So our safari is going to start in Murtala Muhammed International Airport in Lagos, Nigeria. About 15 years ago, I landed in Murtala Muhammed International Airport, but you'll be shocked to learn that at that time, I did not even know who Murtala Muhammed was. So I remember asking the people who were in the plane with me once we landed, the Nigerians, who is this Murtala Muhammed? Because for a country's main airport to be named after somebody, he must have been a big deal. So I was very curious. I was not too convinced with the answers they gave me because they told me that he was once our president, he was a good guy, we all liked him. But that did not quench my curiosity on what was it about him. Clearly he's somebody who was very important, somebody who was very consequential. Now, my digging into Murtala Muhammed began to inform my radical Pan-Africanism. You see, I was in Nigeria to work on a book, to write some memoirs, 2 memoirs. And I was going to travel across Nigeria, talking to different people. So I used that chance to also get to understand from these people who Murtala Muhammed was. And I want to tell you in the next 2 minutes who exactly he was and why that matters to Pan-Africanism today. Why it mattered to Pan-Africanism back then. Murtala Muhammed was only 37 years old when he became president in 1975. And for 199 days, he led Nigeria in a very transformative manner. He's the guy who began the plans of moving the capital from Lagos to Abuja into a more central location, so that more Nigerians can feel like the country is theirs, they can take full ownership. He also increased the states in Nigeria from 12 to 19. The reason being, he realized that ethnic strife was tearing apart Nigeria. Just 5 years earlier in 1970, the Biafra War had concluded. The Biafra War had been extremely bloody, and Murtala Muhammed wanted a Nigeria that was completely united. So he knew that having a few more states is going to help to address the regional balance, the ethnic strifes, so that everybody can feel represented. Let me just pause there to say something to Kenyans. You see, Nigeria at that time, after he increased the states from 12 to 19, now Nigeria still has fewer states than Kenya. Yet the population of Kenya is a mere 1/3, less than a third of the population of Nigeria. So Kenya, a country of 55 to 60 million people, having 47 counties, is an example of one of the problems that we have in Africa today. The big man syndrome of politicians looking out for themselves. Nigeria, a country that a lot of times Transparency International usually rates extremely poorly in that integrity index, is still better than Kenya when it comes to ensuring that money is not lost in bureaucracy, in unnecessary administrative units. Now, let's go back to Murtala Muhammed. And remember, we are not just taking a history lesson. By the end of this short segment on Murtala Muhammed, you will understand what it means to Pan-Africanism today, but more importantly, what it means to you in your home, in your office, in your country, wherever you are. As long as you're an African, as long as you're a friend of Africa, you've got to realize that Pan-Africanism will make or break your life. Pan-Africanism will make your life better or make it worse. Now, there's something that Murtala Muhammed did that spoke to the boldness that is required in our leaders today, to the boldness that is required in all Africans today. You see, at that time, in 1975, 1976, the apartheid regime was extremely strong in South Africa. A lot of presidents globally, including the United States of America, were shying away from speaking out forcefully against the apartheid regime. At this time, Nelson Mandela was still in prison. At this time, the apartheid regime was treating black people in South Africa as lesser, as children of a lesser god. And a lot of times they were also doing it in the name of religion. So the easy thing to do for presidents at that time was to just take it easy, was to take it casually in the name of diplomacy. But Murtala Muhammed spoke out extremely forcefully against that. He also spoke out very forcefully against the Portuguese in Angola, because they were completely cruel to the freedom fighters in Angola. So he spoke out forcefully in support of the freedom fighters in Angola. And then the icing on the cake, at some point in 1976, he gave an extremely powerful speech in Addis Ababa, in the Organization of African Unity conference in Addis Ababa. He said that Africa is in our hands to make or to mar. Africa is in our hands to make or to mar. In other words, Africa is in our hands. We can either build it or we can destroy it. Those words, when you ponder over them deeply, you begin to realize that unfortunately, today's generation of African leaders, the vast majority, today's generations of Africans themselves, the vast majority, instead of building Africa with their hands, they are destroying Africa. But Murtala Muhammed wanted everybody to know that it was up to the people themselves to now build Africa. Why is that important to you? Because today Africa is facing immense challenges that can only be solved if Africans come together, if Africans become proactive. These problems cannot be solved by the politicians alone. They cannot be solved by the policymakers alone. They can only be solved by Africans realizing that Africa is in their hands to make or to mar. Now, before I conclude about Murtala Muhammed, I want you to know one thing. This show is your show. This is our show. This is a Pan-African show. And the goal of this show is to ensure that we begin to make Africa instead of destroying it. The goal is for us to sharpen each other's minds, to lift each other's spirits, so that, just like Murtala Muhammed said, we can begin making Africa. I call it transformative Pan-Africanism. This is a Pan-Africanism that is not just romanticizing the notion of being African. That is not just saying that we're the cradle of mankind. Because when you say we're the cradle of mankind, but we don't transform the continent, the bullets keep flying, people continue sleeping hungry, diseases continue to ravage us, that will not help the people of Africa. We must now embrace a transformative Pan-Africanism that makes life better for every single African. So that is the lesson that you have to take away from Murtala Muhammed and leaders like him. We're going to talk about more of those leaders in the next 1 hour. And remember, we are not talking about them from a historical perspective only, but we are talking about them so that we can understand how they treated Pan-Africanism in their time and how that relates to you and I. Now, before we leave Nigeria, let me urge every African to do their best to visit Nigeria before they die, or before Jesus comes, or before the last day comes, whatever you believe in. The reason I say that is because we often sometimes make fun of Nigerian memes and in jokes about the accent, about Nollywood, but we need to understand it's a very consequential country. About 1 in 5 or 6 Africans is Nigerian. And if Nigeria gets its act together in terms of transformative governance, in terms of transformative leadership, then the rest of Africa will have to follow suit. That's how influential Nigeria is. So I urge Nigerians, go beyond being good in soccer, go beyond being good in Nollywood, go beyond being good in sprints. You must now become extremely good in transformative Pan-Africanism, because you have a huge responsibility to lead by example. Begin to use Nollywood to bring out the Pan-Africanism that Africa needs. Begin to use your influence to bring out, to fuel the Pan-Africanism that Africa needs. Now we are going to travel from Nigeria all the way to Ghana. Oh my. You know, when I remember my last time in Ghana, I think it's about time I go back there, but I remember the last time I was in Ghana very, very fondly, especially because of one particular moment. It was about 5 p.m. there. And whenever I visit an African country, I have this tradition of just walking out alone, even if we're in a group, so that I can just absorb everything, feel everything, so that my consciousness can be able to totally absorb and feel the vibes of the country. So I did just that, and I left my hotel and I walked out. I had a target in mind. There's one specific place I wanted to go back to, because when I visited it a few years earlier, it had really left a mark on me. And this place in Ghana, in Accra, the next time you're in Accra, make sure you go there. I walked to the Kwame Nkrumah Memorial Park. And then I looked at his statue with his hand raised forward. And for some reason, I became emotional because I began to remember the words that Kwame Nkrumah said, that we face neither east nor west, but we face forward. I remembered that Kwame Nkrumah is in fact the father of the original Pan-Africanism, because his country, Ghana, was the first one to gain independence back in 1957. And Kwame Nkrumah was extremely passionate about a united Africa. I remembered all these things as I looked at his statue. And then I also remembered something really tragic. I remembered how in 1966, February 24th, Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown. He had so many dreams for a United States of Africa. He literally gave his life to provide thought leadership towards a United States of Africa. And then when I remembered the circumstances leading to his overthrow, I felt a rage within me. And as I speak to you now, I still feel that rage. Because Kwame Nkrumah was democratically elected. He was a democratically elected leader of an African country. Not just any African country, but the first one to gain independence on this continent. The symbolism of that was extremely powerful. The enemies of Africa knew that if you take out Kwame Nkrumah, you deal Africa an almost mortal blow. And then I dug deep to try and understand how was Kwame Nkrumah overthrown. He was not killed, thankfully, but by killing him politically. The same people, the same forces behind the tragic deaths of these 22 African heads of state who were assassinated while still in office, those forces behind that are the same forces that were behind Kwame Nkrumah's overthrow. Now, I urge everybody, every single African out there, if Africa is to rise, if Africa is to become a different place, we must nurture our critical thinking. We must use our minds and our hearts to transform this continent. Because that's what Kwame Nkrumah did. And when you think critically and you begin to join the dots, you begin to understand these forces that were behind his overthrow. I'll give you a few leads and urge you to dig deeper for yourself. In January 1966, Mr. Williams became an ambassador of USA in Ghana. Williams was a guy with very close ties to the CIA. He was a guy with very close ties to some elements in the Ghanaian army. 3 weeks later, after he became ambassador of USA in Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown. At the time, he was not even in Ghana. He was visiting China and Vietnam. And his enemies chose that particular moment to overthrow Kwame Nkrumah. We do not talk about this enough. And my prayer and my hope is that Africa will begin talking about these injustices enough. Not because we're fixated to the past, but because the same enemies who took out Kwame Nkrumah politically, who took out Murtala Muhammed, took out his life, who took out the lives of many other African leaders, those same forces, those same enemies are still very much vibrant, alive, and active. And unless we talk about this, so that the African awakening can bring up Africans in arms, not violence, and by arms I mean to bring up the consciousness of Africans, to address these sinister forces. If we don't do that, that's why they keep repeating this over and over. In this scenario, it's clear that Mr. Williams was sent to Ghana to ensure that Kwame Nkrumah's overthrow was finalized. And do you know what was Kwame Nkrumah's fault? Ask yourself, what could be so bad that the enemies of Ghana, the enemies of Africa would want Kwame Nkrumah dead politically? What could be so bad? Why was he such a threat to them? Ask yourself that question. And that's what I mean by critical thinking, that we have to now fight this battle today with our mind, with our unity, with our spirit. And part of that spirit, central to that spirit, is Ubuntu. I am because we are because I am. We are one people. We have to fight these enemies, these forces, at that level, because they cannot defeat us there. The reason they hated Kwame Nkrumah that much? There are a number of reasons, but today I'll address only one. The Cold War, pitting the West against the East, with USA and the then Soviet, USSR, being the main players in that Cold War. Africa suffered a lot because of that Cold War. And for the West, for America, unless you were explicitly with them, they considered you to be an enemy. But Kwame Nkrumah made it clear that Africa does not face East. In other words, is not for the Soviets. Neither does it face West. In other words, it's not for America and their allies. But Africa is facing forward. We are facing forward. We're just seeking to rebuild. That was his attitude, and he mobilized Africa. Many African countries became part of the non-aligned movement that refused to take sides in that Cold War. But because of that leadership that he provided, Kwame Nkrumah became a mortal enemy to the United States of America. Why then should they take him out politically? Is it just because of that Cold War? The answer to that question will be clear by the time we are done with this show, because the answer to that question informs why to date these sinister forces continue to play their games in this continent of Africa. Now, there's a lot to unpack about Kwame Nkrumah and his philosophies, and we will keep doing that in the coming months. But for today, the takeaway, the sparkling gem of knowledge that I urge you to take away from this conversation and go and keep in your treasure box, because that treasure box is what will transform you into an African who will transform this continent. The sparkling gem of knowledge that I urge you to take away from Kwame Nkrumah today is this. After he was overthrown, Kwame Nkrumah ended up living the rest of his life, only 6 years, because he died in 1972 in Guinea. Sekou Touré, the president of Guinea, invited him to Guinea and even made him an honorary co-president. That's how tight they were. It's the kind of unity amongst leaders that was making a difference in Africa at that time, that would have taken Africa to the next level had the West not interfered like they did. But here's the takeaway. Here's what I want you to take away. He spent these 6 years of his life not mourning, not behaving like a victim, not lashing out, but he ended up writing more than 20 books. I urge you to look up some of these books and read for yourself what he believed in and why he was urging Africa to be united. One of these books is of relevance in this show today. It talks about neocolonialism as being the last part of imperialism, the last stage of imperialism. We, in today's Africa, the current generation of Africa, we must now become thought leaders just like he was. We must make our case to each other, and even if thought leadership is not your thing, make it your business to dig deeper about what is happening in Africa today and why it is happening. That's the reason we're calling this show African Awakening. Because unless the people of Africa follow the footsteps of Kwame Nkrumah and awaken consciously, unless the people of Africa begin to interrogate what's happening to us and why it's happening and what we should do, they will continue taking us for a ride. For today, our safari in Ghana will have to conclude there. But make no mistake, we are going to continue interrogating a lot more of Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah, not out of nostalgia, but so that we can pick many of the things that he taught that are still relevant to us today. And also, we can avoid the mistakes that he also made. Because if we repeat the same mistakes, then we end up with the same fate. Now, before we proceed with our safari today to South Africa, and I promise you that's going to be an amazing part of this journey. For the next 10 minutes, we are going to travel now to South Africa, and we're going to glean from there what we need to understand about the Pan-Africanism of the 70s and 80s, and what it means to us today, how it can help us to be transformative Pan-Africanists. Good people, fellow Africans, I am really having a great time, and I look forward to doing this with you every single week on Thursday. The African Awakening show will be coming to you. Now, before we land in OR Tambo Airport, I want to send a shout out. I want to send a shout out to the radical Pan-Africanists who are already playing their role to make this continent a better place. And one of them is known as Lynn Ngugi. Her show, LNN, is quickly becoming one of the most consequential Pan-African shows on the continent. I celebrate you, Lynn, and I celebrate you, every single African toiling, either in the shadows or in the limelight, to make this place a better place. Now, we are landing in OR Tambo International Airport. Again, if you haven't visited South Africa, you have to put it on your bucket list. South Africa is an extremely amazing country, and I love South Africa dearly. I can't have enough of South Africa. That particular day, when I landed at OR Tambo International Airport in Johannesburg, I wanted to kill some time before I left the airport because I had arrived a bit early. So I decided to walk in a couple of bookshops at the airport. And I remember walking into this tiny little bookshop, probably 3 meters by 3 meters. And one book caught my eye. I literally dove towards that book. You'd have thought there was a scramble for the book. This book, the title was, I Write What I Like. I just loved the title, even before I knew who wrote the book. But I didn't have to look at the name of the writer of the book because I knew that face. I knew that face so much because this face belonged to somebody who is one of my role models. In fact, I credit him for the title of this show, African Awakening, because this guy, although they took him out, they took his life when he was only in his early 30s. And I have never forgiven the apartheid regime for doing that. I'm talking about Steve Biko. I remember taking that book, paying instantly, and I was late to leave the airport to go to my hotel because I had to read chapter 1 of the book. I was so eager to understand why Steve Biko was the person that he was. And this book is not about him, it's from him, in his own words. Now, when you look at Steve Biko, one of the tragedies of contemporary Africa and contemporary Pan-Africanism is the fact that a lot of the people in today's Africa, irrespective of their age, are forgetting about Steve Biko. Yet, they are not forgetting about many of these Western heroes that we learn about in our schools. They are not forgetting them, but they are forgetting about Steve Biko. So I'm going to seize this chance before I continue to challenge all the curriculum developers across Africa. You have got to integrate Pan-Africanism into your studies from primary school to the university level. Because Africans must never ever forget people like Steve Biko, but they will if it is not part of our education. Why is it that the average African knows that George Washington was the first president of America, but they do not know about Steve Biko? It's unacceptable, it's unconscionable. So I challenge African countries that seem to have leaders who are true Pan-Africanists of today's Africa, countries like, of course, Burkina Faso, countries like Namibia. Namibia seems to have a very powerful lady who we're praying is going to be a transformative leader. Botswana with Duma Boko. I challenge those three countries and others to make it very clear that they are going to integrate Pan-Africanism into primary school education and secondary school education so that the upcoming generation of Africans can be truly Black, conscious of who they are. And the reason I say that at this juncture is because Steve Biko was the founder of the Black Consciousness Movement. This Black Consciousness Movement, as the name suggests, he also believed that if the Black consciousness becomes increasingly stronger, then the people of South Africa would be able to defeat apartheid. He believed that you've got to be proud of who you are as a Black person. He believed that without Black consciousness, then Africans themselves will continue looking at themselves as inferior, whether consciously or subconsciously. Now, the sad reality is this: today's generation of Africa needs that message more than ever before. Something as simple as kinky hair. Kinky hair is one of the most powerful crowns on this earth. But a lot of times, you find people regarding kinky hair as something that has to be treated, something that has to be addressed or corrected. You may say that it's for pure cosmetic purposes, but when you're talking about Black consciousness, it means being proud of every inch of your body, every inch of a psyche as a Black person. And Steve Biko became so powerful with his Black consciousness message that he inspired a generation of teenagers in Soweto to rise up in the famous Soweto uprising. He inspired them to do so. Teenagers, let that be a challenge to today's youth here in Africa, that your time is now. It is no longer tomorrow, but it is now. Your time to rise up and demand good governance, transformative leadership is now. Your time to rise up and speak against the injustices across the continent is now. It is not tomorrow, it is now. But you can only do that if you embrace Black consciousness. And Black consciousness is simply the African awakening of Africans themselves beginning to believe that they are more than worthy, that they are priceless, that we are priceless. If anybody in this world should feel superior, it is actually Africans, because we're the cradle of mankind, we're the cradle of humanity. So we must continue with that battle from where Steve Biko left it. To understand more about the sinister forces that are against Africa, that I promised you will become clear by the end of this show, ask yourself, why would a regime kill a 31-year-old Black South African who was not even shooting anybody, who was not even violent? Why would they jail him, take him to prison, torture him and kill him? Why would they do that? They must have known something that you and I need to know and embrace. They knew that Steve Biko's message of Black consciousness was the one thing that was going to make a vast difference in Africa, was the one thing that was going to transform South Africa. If the Black consciousness that Steve Biko preached, if that Black consciousness, if that message had not been lost, then I dare say that the inequality we see today in South Africa would not be there. Because South Africans, black South Africans, would have understood that power is not given, it's taken. And it's not just about political power, it's also about economic power. And how do you take economic power? If you're conscious of your blackness, then you take economic power by deploying the totality of your assets, the totality of your potential. You deploy that, and then you take economic power. In South Africa, they took political power, but they didn't take economic power. And to date, South Africa remains the most unequal country in the world. Steve Biko would shudder in the grave. The good news is that we can correct that by integrating black consciousness into everything that we do in today's Africa. We must be proudly black, and we must go beyond the semantics and realize that black consciousness is not about putting down any other race, but it is about lifting ourselves into the full potential of who we are. And more specifically in today's Africa, it is about taking economic power. It is unacceptable that nearly half of the people in sub-Saharan Africa, about 600 million people, continue to live in multi-dimensional poverty. It is unacceptable. And we must not accept that as business as usual. It must be business unusual in today's Africa by us embracing the black consciousness that will take us forward economically. Before we move away from South Africa, I want you to know that we will come back to South Africa in this show. We're going to finish with another South African leader. But before we move away from South Africa to go to a country that I deeply love, again, let me urge you, every Thursday, do not miss to tune in for the Africa Awakening show. Do not miss to tune in for the African Awakening show. I credit Steve Biko for that title because the African Awakening stems from the black consciousness. And I say thank you very much, Steve Biko. The best honor that we can pay this young leader of Africa who was taken away too soon is to ensure that wherever sector you're in, whatever it is that you do with your life as an African, whether you're a business person, whether you're in career, whether you're a student or a politician, make sure that you nurture the black consciousness, without which it's so easy to go through life looking at yourself as lesser. Our Pan-African safari is going to take us to an amazing West African country. Before I tell you the one that we're going to, I think you can make a guess which country the world is currently extremely crazy about in West Africa. We are going to go there. But again, let me urge every single African to visit Africa. Visit Africa. I challenge the middle class and the upper class who keep going to London, who keep going to Dubai. No offense to those countries, or New York. I challenge them to begin going to Africa. After all, there's a lot more to see right here in Africa than in London or Dubai or New York, because the sheer versatility of Africa is mind-blowing and breathtaking. So I challenge you to visit Africa. And even if you do not have the money at the moment, begin making a plan. Start with your neighboring country. Because Africa is ours. And unless this generation of Africa begins to reach out and visit other African countries, we continue existing in isolation. And that's what the enemy wants. Back in 2007, January, I was in my late 20s. I know that makes me rather old. But I remember that period very, very fondly, because something special happened in Nairobi. The World Social Forum was taking place. And at the time, I had founded the Kenya Indymedia, which was the Kenya chapter of the Global Indymedia Network. This was a network of media activists who believed in using their media activism to change the world. So I had invited all these other media activists from the Global Indymedia to come to Nairobi for the World Social Forum. And one of my friends, who was working very closely with me in that, had started an organization that was taking part in this World Social Forum. I asked him what the name of the organization was, and he told me it was called Sankara Center. Now, I'm extremely ashamed to admit to you today that at that time, I did not even know who Sankara was. So I asked him, why would you name your organization Sankara Center? He was a lot older than me, and when Sankara was president, he was a young person himself who got to experience the utter inspiration of Sankara in real time. So it was through my friend. His name was Onyango Olo. Sadly, he's no longer with us. But it was through him that I actually got to know about Thomas Sankara. Now, let me use that to again urge African educators, African policymakers to ensure that if you truly care for Africa, like you all say you do, you've got to ensure that people like Sankara and Biko and Murtala Muhammed, all these amazing heroes of Africa, have got to be integrated into the school curriculum. Because there I was, somebody in my late 20s, and I had no idea who Thomas Sankara was, yet I considered myself already a revolutionary. How much more for other Africans who don't even consider themselves revolutionaries? Anyway, through my friend, I got to learn about Thomas Sankara, and from that moment, I dug deep and deep and deep and read every single book that I could read about Thomas Sankara. I talked to my friends from Burkina Faso. It made me to even learn French quicker because I was so eager to hear Thomas Sankara's speeches in French, in his own language. I did not even want interpretation anymore. Now, the more I learned about Thomas Sankara, the more I realized why those same sinister forces took him out. Remember, I told you at the beginning of this show that 22 heads of state here in Africa have lost their lives while still serving in office. Thomas Sankara was tragically one of them. Ask yourself again, what is it that he had that made them take his life? That question, I cannot overemphasize why it is extremely important. Because those same sinister forces are still alive and active today. They're even more powerful. And unless Africans begin to understand how they operate and why they took out Sankara and those 21 others and people like Biko, unless we really understand, we are going to continue shooting blanks in the dark. Today, I just want to share one thing about Thomas Sankara. Number one, it's critical for Africans to understand that it is not enough to build myths out of our great leaders. When we reduce them to mythology, we're doing injustice to the substance of what they stood for and what they represented. We must remember that, especially of somebody like Traoré, that even as we praise him, rightfully so, because he's inspiring us, it is very important for us to look at the substance of what he stands for and what he represents, because failure to do so, we end up putting them on a pedestal, and a lot of times, we don't even do what they would want us to do because we don't know it. So I have made it my business to really understand what somebody like Thomas Sankara stood for, especially Thomas Sankara. And today I'll just share one thing because it is so relevant in today's Africa. It is so relevant to you as an African, to you as a friend of Africa. One of the things that Thomas Sankara did, at the time in Burkina Faso, there were people that were known as the feudal landlords. These were the people who owned vast tracts of land because of their political connections and because it was a class-based society. And on these vast tracts of land, other poor Abakinabe would live as squatters. Thomas Sankara said, wait a minute, Burkina Faso belongs to the people of Burkina Faso. How is it that just a few people can own vast tracts of land in this country? So, what did he do? He instituted reforms that led to the ordinary so-called poor Bakinabe owning land in Burkina Faso. The government that he led was able to systematically redistribute land in Burkina Faso. Now, here's a crazy thing. A lot of this land used to lie idle because these feudal landlords would not even cultivate this land. It was just there for their gratification to feel that I'm a rich person, I've got a lot of land. Thomas Sankara ensured that systematically he was able to redistribute that land. That is why you never hear that what happened to Zimbabwe then happened in Burkina Faso. Because Thomas Sankara truly wanted the people to own this land. It was not some political gimmick for him and his cronies to end up simply replacing the feudal landlords and becoming feudal landlords themselves. Because that's what happened in Kenya. We're going to address that one of the coming weeks. The Mau who fought in Kenya, who shed blood so that Kenya can be free, ended up landless. Because leaders like Mzee Jomo Kenyatta and his cronies ended up owning this land. They simply replaced the white person. But Thomas Sankara didn't do that because he truly wanted the people of Burkina Faso to own land and use it. What happened as a result? Within 3 years, and again, as I always say, you can dig this information up. You can research for yourself. Within 3 years, Burkina Faso's wheat production doubled because the people had land and the people could use this land. He empowered the so-called peasants. But in today's Africa, those so-called peasants, the smallholders who own 1 acre of land and less, who don't even own land, who have to lease land if they have the money, they remain completely disempowered. So the lesson for us today, in today's Pan-Africanism, is this. The quality of your leader, the quality of your president, the quality of your member of parliament, the quality of your governor is directly proportionate to the quality of your life. Because there are a number of things that you can never do for yourself, however successful you are. You cannot build good roads. It's not your duty to do so. The government should do it. You cannot put in place systems that will ensure that smallholders in this country, across Africa, are able to earn from their sweat. You cannot do that. But the leaders that you elect are the ones who should be able to do that. Which is why we must now borrow a leaf from Thomas Sankara. We must now follow in the footsteps of Thomas Sankara and address the land issue in Africa. It remains extremely emotive. A few minutes from now, I'm going to explain to you something called agro-colonialism. That is a strong part of the neo-colonialism that we are facing today. That is back because we have not borrowed a leaf from Thomas Sankara and say that African land belongs to Africans and they have a right to use this land to make their lives better, to feed their families. Today, many policies and many governments are disempowering African smallholders in so many ways. But Thomas Sankara believed that they have to be empowered so that they can be able to produce optimally from the land that belongs to them anyway. It's very important for today's Pan-Africanism. I urge every African to interact with African land. You don't have to own the land. If you can own it, the better. But even if you do not own land here in Africa and you're an African, make it your business to occasionally just go out and touch the African soil and realize that people have lost lives because of that soil. Realize that this soil in your hands can feed the continent of Africa and feed the world. Because after all, 60% of the remaining arable land in this world is right here in Africa. That's how powerful we are. But if we continue with the kind of leadership that we have today, then this land will not even benefit the people of Africa. Your role as a Pan-Africanist in today's Pan-Africanism is to ensure that you inform yourself about this African land, is to ensure that if you can, you begin to cultivate this African land, you begin to use it to ensure that we have total food sovereignty on this continent. Now, we are going to leave Burkina Faso and fly back to South Africa. But talking about flying, wouldn't it be amazing if we could just drive around Africa, if we had highways that interconnected the entirety of the African continent? That is something that we should not be struggling about 60 years after independence. But we will touch on that later. Let's, for now, because it's tricky to drive from Burkina Faso to Johannesburg, let's just catch a flight. Let's just catch a flight and go back to South Africa. Now, in 1990 February, a 70-something-year-old man flew from South Africa to the United States of America. He was newly released from prison. He went to the Ted Koppel show. He didn't know that they had laid traps for him in that show. What had happened is that they had planted a number of people in this show to ask this 70-year-old man questions that they were hoping would nail him and paint him in bad light. So, a few minutes into the show, somebody stood up with a question, and he asked this man, why is it, I paraphrase, why is it that despite all the human rights violations in Cuba, despite all the human rights violations that the PLO is meting out on people in Palestine, in Israel, despite all the supposed human rights violations in these countries, why is it that you still support these presidents? This person also referenced Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. I think by now you probably know who I'm talking about. Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, this clip is on YouTube. You can search it so that you see for yourself how he handled this very masterfully. Nelson Mandela, without missing a beat, first of all looked at Ted Koppel, who was part of this sinister plan to undermine Mandela. Then he looked at the questioner, and then he said, and I paraphrase, that one of the mistakes America makes is to assume that their enemies must be our enemies. Mandela then said that Muammar Gaddafi, Yasser Arafat, and Fidel Castro stood by South Africa, stood by the African National Congress. They didn't just provide them moral support, they gave them financial support. They even supplied resources and weaponry to help the African National Congress to fight the apartheid regime. Meanwhile, What did America do? What did America do under John F. Kennedy to help the African National Congress? Zero. What did America do under Eisenhower before Kennedy to help the African National Congress? Zero. What did the United States of America do under Ronald Reagan to help Mandela and the African National Congress? Zero. What did America do under Jimmy Carter to help the African National Congress? Zero. So Mandela put them in their place and told them, these three gentlemen that you want me to hate stood by us and helped us. They helped us. Richard Nixon didn't help us. John Kennedy didn't help us. Ronald Reagan didn't help us. Jimmy Carter didn't help us. But Fidel Castro did. But Yasser Arafat did. These people helped us. Muammar Gaddafi helped us. And it is not in my place to hate them just because they're your enemies. The reason I share this is very simple. There's a powerful lesson hid there for today's Pan-Africanism. Number one, we must know our friends and stand with those friends. We must stand by our friends. We must also understand that in the grand scheme of things in the global geopolitics, the vast majority of nations, including those we think are our friends, are truly only serving their own national interests. Sometimes we mistake that for friendship, but they're just serving their own national interests. And it is up to Africa to also serve its own continental interests, not national interests, but continental interests. Because for too long, African leaders, they serve their own national interests at the expense of continental interests, and that weakens us. But there's a lesson I want you to understand from this exchange, from the life of Nelson Mandela. Mandela, nowadays, from some quarters, is not regarded in a very flattering light. There are people who blame him for the fact that in South Africa, the inequality remains rampant, that the black people comparatively remain poor. There are people who blame him for that. But it is very, very important for these people and every African to understand that unless the African people themselves wake up, unless we rise up, unless we allow black consciousness to reign supreme in us, there isn't a single leader who will give us economic power. Not a single leader. We've got to understand that. Mandela himself said after he was released from prison that I am not a prophet, I'm just your humble servant. And therein lies a very powerful lesson for today's Pan-Africanism. Here's the thing. Liberation is not an event. It is a journey. Liberation is not an event. It's a journey. Awakening is not a moment. It's a process. Mandela did his part, but the people, partly because of the impact of the Western-style democracy, the influence of the Western-style democracy that seeks to create messiahs out of leaders. And in so doing, it's very deliberate because when the people wait for a messiah, they become very passive. They become very passive. They become very laid back because they are waiting for the messiah to save them. And that's the influence of the Western-style democracy that has turned Africans into people who perennially wait for messiahs in the name of leaders to come and save them, not knowing that these leaders are often a reflection of your own attitude, of your own spirit. So let us learn from the example of Mandela. You can see from the exchange that he had with Ted Koppel and the guests who were there that this is somebody who truly meant well for South Africa and for Africa. Now, he had his shortcomings, but to remain fixated on those shortcomings, again, excuses us from taking action as Africans. We must be proactive, and once we realize that liberation is a journey, then we do not leave it to any single driver to take us forward. We realize that we have to share, not just in the driving forward of this African vehicle, but in maintaining it. There's something for everybody to do in this journey. Once we realize that the African awakening is a process, every time we fall down, we stand up, dust ourselves, and keep walking, keep moving forward. So it's very important for today's Pan-Africanism to appreciate the fact that those who were there before us did their bit. They may have fallen short, or they may have even taken us for a ride, as many of them did. However, it is now incumbent on us, because the baton has been passed on to us. It is now incumbent on us to take Africa forward, to allow the process, the African awakening process, to continue unfolding in a powerful way that is completely unstoppable. So let us ensure that Mandela's long walk to freedom is perceived as part of a process that is still unfolding. We are not yet free, especially economically. That's why the Economic Freedom Fighters Party of Julius Malema was very successful, resonated a lot with South Africans and Africans as a whole. But if we understand that it is not even up to Malema to then save Africa, or in this scenario, it is not up to Ibrahim Traoré to save Africa, it is up to Africans themselves to ensure that all these leaders play their part, knowing very well that they are servants of the people. So take this sparkling gem of knowledge and keep it in your treasure box. That liberation is a journey, that awakening is a process. Let us not reduce it to one single moment or to one single person, because when we do so, we excuse ourselves from playing the part that we should, and when we do that, the awakening is interfered with, the liberation is interfered with, and Africa becomes weaker. Now, before we fly away from OR Tambo International Airport, I have a request for everybody watching this. This is your show. This is our show. I invite everybody to send questions either on the issues that we've discussed in today's show or any African issue that weighs you down or lifts up your spirit. You know, it's not always about the problems we're going through. Sometimes it's about the small and big victories that we need to celebrate. So I urge everybody, feel free to share your questions, to share your comments. If you can do so by video, the better. You don't have to do it, but if you can do so by video, we will ensure that as much as possible, we actually play those videos so that fellow Africans and people around the world can be able to watch you and hear from you directly, your question or your comment. So I urge everybody, in the spirit of now being proactive, because I've told you, ain't nobody who's gonna save you. We have to save ourselves. We have to be the people who step out with a black consciousness overflowing within us to make Africa a better place. And one way that you can start doing that is to be very, very active in this show and in other shows that are seeking to make a difference. So if you have a question, if you have a comment on Africa, on Pan-Africanism as a whole, feel free to share in the comments, or feel free, if it's a video, you can send via WhatsApp or via WeTransfer on the numbers, on the contacts that you're seeing on the screen. And we will be happy to play that because this is your show. Now, moving on. We're now flying to Jomo Kenyatta International Airport in Nairobi, Kenya. Those of you who do not know, Jomo Kenyatta was Kenya's first president, and for very long he was hailed as an African liberator, as an African hero. But as time goes by, because black consciousness is rising, because the people's awareness is becoming stronger and stronger, People are beginning to dig deeper, not to malign him, but for the truth to come out. And you know the truth always comes out. And if we do not learn from the truth, then the injustices that are hid in that truth, that are contained in that truth, keep recurring, keep happening. Anyway, story for another day. Now we are in Jomo Kenyatta International Airport. For those of you who haven't visited Kenya, you need to do so, because Kenya is clearly one of the most beautiful, amazing countries in the world. Kenya has the totality of semi-arid land to mountains to all manner of terrain and geographical features. Kenya sits right on the equator, meaning that the weather and the climate is absolutely stunning and amazing. And the people of Kenya are very proactive in seeking to make a difference in their country. But I now challenge the people of Kenya to begin doing so in Africa, because in Africa we will either rise together or sink together. It is impossible to have a prosperous, singular African nation. It is impossible for that to happen. So Kenya is leading the way in terms of people speaking out. And now that must be used across the continent. It must spread across the continent. Now we're in Kenya. And I myself, as DJ Bwakali, at this particular moment, I truly celebrate this amazing country. 1 year ago, I was in another amazing country known as Tanzania, Kenya's neighbor. Specifically, I was in Tanga. It was June 21st, and the demonstrations in Kenya, the Gen Z demonstrations, were in full force. And I remember that time in Tanga, I love the ocean a lot. I'm crazy about the ocean. So I went to the beach, a rocky beach somewhere in Tanga, because I wanted to do a video, send a message to people across Kenya and Africa. And this video was simply talking about Kenyans being fed up. And there was an unstoppable force brewing in Kenya that nobody was going to be able to stop. I did that video with the background of the ocean, with that amazing power, unstoppable power of the waves behind me. And then I shared it. And I was pleasantly surprised when a lot of people began interacting with that, because at that moment, Kenya was right in the middle of those Gen Z demonstrations. And I was itching to travel back to Kenya so that I can be part of that. But the earliest I could leave was June 25th. So I remember arriving at the border in Namanga, and some of the immigration officials recognized me from that particular video and from my Pan-African work. And I was like, I think maybe there's gonna be trouble here. But I was surprised to learn that just like other Kenyans, they were also hurting. They spoke in coded language, but it was very, very clear on whose side they were on in these demonstrations. In fact, they're the ones who told me, because it was about 6 p.m., they're the ones who told me that Parliament had been breached, that demonstrators had made their way to Parliament. And as I drove from Namanga, I remember seeing the army on either side of the road, and it was clear to me that things were now different in the country. So the rest is history. We now know what then happened. We know that so many Kenyans lost their lives, most of them young people. We now know that these young Kenyans were able to bring an entire government down because the president sacked the entire cabinet, even though he still sneaked some of them back, and even though to a large extent it remained business as usual. But these young Kenyans had made a statement that Africans were tired of bad leadership, that Africans were tired, that it was no longer going to be business as usual. They had spoken out loudly and clearly that finally those words contained in the Constitution of Kenya and in constitutions across Africa, that we the people, that sovereign power is vested in we the people, they had finally said that enough was enough. Those words had to come to life, and we the people had to take action and take the driver's seat, because the vehicle was headed towards the cliff. It still is. But now that awakening, that consciousness is very much present in Kenya. It's very much present in several other African countries, but it must become louder and bigger. And the reason I conclude with that in today's show is simply because the biggest, most powerful resource in Africa is the youth of Africa. 70% of people in Africa are below the age of 30 years old. There is no other continent in the world that has such a youthful population. So when the youth of Africa do like the youth of Kenya did, of stepping forward and realizing that it is up to us, it is up to we the people, that is what must drive contemporary Pan-Africanism. That is what must fuel transformative Pan-Africanism. For this amazing youth of Africa to realize that they can no longer be on the sidelines, to follow in the footsteps of Steve Biko, of Thomas Sankara. And it gives me great joy to add to that list to follow in the footsteps of Kenya's Gen Z, because they showed the world what can be done when Africans come together and say, Tosha, enough is enough. It is very, very important for the rest of Africa to use that as a resounding rallying call and say, Tosha, enough is enough. The people of Zimbabwe deserve better. The people of Tanzania deserve better. The people of South Africa deserve better. The people of Ghana deserve better. Nigeria, they deserve better. Algeria, they deserve better. Egypt, across Africa, the people of Africa deserve to live in a continent where people are not fleeing from and dying in the Mediterranean, seeking a better life in Europe, a better life that no longer exists. The people of Africa are tired. And let that be the rallying call that is going to resound across Africa, that enough is enough. And Africa must now be the place that it was meant to be. A place where every African who lives is living for pleasure, not because of necessity. A place where nobody is fleeing away from because they have sufficient food on their table, because they have decent livelihoods. That is the Africa that contemporary Pan-Africanism must work towards. And this Africa is not possible if we do not unite. My concluding message and rallying call today is that we must increasingly look at ways of uniting. And in next week's show, we are going to go deeper to understand how neocolonialism has kept us from uniting, but how we can fight back, not in a reactionary manner, but in a very strategic, systematic manner. Next week, we will take a deep dive into how exactly Africa can begin uniting so that neocolonialism can crumble and so that transformative Pan-Africanism can reign supreme. I thank you very much for joining us in this premiere show. Asanteni sana. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup à tous. It was such a delight to be with you in this premiere show of African Awakening, in this premiere episode of African Awakening. This is going to be a show that you can interact with because it belongs to you, it is yours. So every Thursday, make sure that you tune in. And as I said earlier, feel free to share your comments, to share your questions, so that we can ensure that this is a conversation where we're all learning from one another. And remember, The Pan-African sun is rising. No force on earth, nobody in the world can keep it from rising.